This means nothing. You think this earns you special treatment?" The young officer's shout cracked across the waiting room like a slap, silencing the quiet drone of voices, printers, and old ceiling fans. His uniform was crisp, his jaw clenched, one finger pointed like a weapon at the small bronze medal trembling in the old man's hand. Without waiting for a reply, he stepped forward, snatched it, and threw it to the floor. The medal hit tile with a clatter that rang louder than it should have, spinning once before settling near the base of a trash can. Conversations died mid-sentence. Chairs stopped squeaking. A woman dropped her pen. The badge on the officer's chest glinted under fluorescent lights, still and cold. The old man didn't move at first. His head tilted slightly, eyes fixed on the spot where the medal had fallen. His breathing had changed. Not faster, but shallower, like someone trying to control a pain he'd learned to live with. He took a small step forward, knees stiff, then crouched down slower than gravity wanted him to. His hand hovered over the medal for a moment, fingers splayed, as if afraid to touch something that now carried more weight than bronze. He picked it up with 2 fingers and a folded cloth from his coat pocket. Still no words, just a breath, drawn deep and silent. The officer crossed his arms and exhaled through his nose. "Let the others go. This guy's just wasting everyone's time." Behind the counter, the clerk's face flushed pale. She looked between the officer and the man crouched on the floor, unsure of what she was supposed to do, unsure of what she was allowed to do. Near the back of the room, beneath the humming lights and peeling posters, a man in a dark gray suit stopped walking. His briefcase hung still at his side. Without a word, he set it on the floor, reached into his jacket, and pulled out a slim, secured phone. He pressed one button, raised it to his ear. The call had already been made. "If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most." The line had resumed its idle crawl, but the atmosphere in the room had changed. No one spoke loudly anymore. Pages turned softer. Even the child who had been spinning in the vinyl chair was now still, watching the old man return slowly to his seat. He didn't look at the others. He didn't meet the officer's gaze. He simply sat down, folded the cloth-wrapped medal in his lap, and pressed it between both palms. His name was Martin Hale, age 81. His file at the Department of Motor Vehicles was thick but tidy. A man who never missed deadlines, never forgot a renewal. Every form came in a leather folder creased with age and care, its spine soft from years of use. The clerk at window number 3 had seen him before, though she wasn't sure if she'd ever heard him speak more than a sentence. He always waited, always early. No appointments, no complaints. Today he had brought the medal, not for display, not as a plea, but as supporting documentation, a desperate hope that it might move his housing paperwork forward. His rent had gone up again. The subsidy paperwork was stalled somewhere in the system. He thought maybe, just maybe, the citation might help validate the hardship box he had checked on line 24. His jacket had been tailored once, long ago, the fabric now threadbare at the elbows. When he opened it to retrieve another form, a glimpse of the inside lining showed something faded and written in black ink. A string of initials, a date, and a number that meant nothing to anyone else but him. His fingers, swollen at the knuckles, moved with care as he separated the pages and removed a paperclip, setting everything back in perfect order on his lap. The young officer stood 10 feet away, arms crossed, posture wide. He hadn't looked at Martin again since tossing the medal, but his presence lingered, like a threat unspoken. People moved cautiously near him, not because they feared violence, but because they feared being noticed. His name tag said, Reynolds. His voice had the kind of volume that didn't need shouting to feel like shouting. From behind the partition, the head clerk leaned toward the next attendant and whispered, "That's Martin Hale. He was a door gunner in Vietnam. Came in on foot after a full hip replacement. I've never seen him ask for anything." The other woman glanced up, then back down at her screen. "He's the one who always sits there at opening? Quiet guy?" The first nodded. Yeah, that folder? He carries that every time. Same ribbons always tucked in the front. Outside, a bus hissed and pulled away from the curb. A pigeon fluttered against the glass briefly, then vanished. Inside, Martin shifted in his chair, the leather folder now placed carefully on his lap again, both hands resting over it, knuckles up, veins like thin cords beneath his skin. He did not wear a hat. His hair was combed neatly, but thin. His hearing aid, barely visible behind one ear, gave a slight whine whenever someone spoke too close. His shoes were polished, brown, creased, army issue from another lifetime. One of the rubber soles had been resoled twice, maybe more. He kept his posture upright, though you could see the fatigue in the way his neck leaned slightly forward, like the years had started to tug downward. The digital number board blinked forward. The next person rose. Martin didn't. His number was still 15 away. He didn't check it. He already knew. One man seated 2 rows behind snorted. That medal probably came from eBay. Another chuckled, not loud, but enough. Bet he printed it out of guilt. Look at him. Doesn't even fight back. Martin didn't turn his head. He blinked once, slow. His thumb moved over the edge of the cloth in his lap, as if checking for a loose thread. The clerk, who knew his name, bit the inside of her cheek. Her fingers paused above the keyboard, unsure whether to flag the supervisor or just stay silent. The officer still hadn't moved. His eyes tracked people like check marks on a clipboard, assessing, judging, unconcerned. Martin's eyes were fixed ahead, not at anyone, just ahead. And still, someone had noticed. The vinyl on the seat groaned softly as Martin adjusted his weight. The cushion had flattened over the years, the kind used in every government building from California to Maine, unforgiving and warm beneath him. He opened his folder again, the paper rustling in a slow, steady rhythm, not from nervousness but routine. The edges of the documents were slightly curled, some yellowed. He smoothed each one down with the flat of his palm like a man pressing out wrinkles in a flag. His coat, folded across his knees, had been with him since before the last snowstorm. He wore it even when the room ran hot, as it did today. A bead of sweat traced down the side of his neck, catching in the creases below his ear, but he didn't move to wipe it. His discipline was bone deep. The medal, now wrapped again in a faded handkerchief, rested between his palm and the top page. He didn't clutch it. He held it with reverence, like something that didn't belong to him alone. The young officer, Reynolds, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the sound of his boots sticking slightly to the tile. He had moved a few steps closer to Martin's row, arms still folded, eyes flicking around the room like a schoolyard bully waiting for a glance he could interpret as challenge. He didn't speak again, not yet, but his posture was language enough. 2 women sitting opposite Martin shared a hushed exchange, their voices just above a whisper. One leaned forward and muttered, "Did you see how long it took him just to sit down?" The other raised a brow, lips pursed. He should have done this online like everyone else. They didn't look at Martin as they spoke. Their judgment was ambient, casual, the kind that dripped slowly, not cruel, just comfortably indifferent. A teenage boy in a hoodie scrolled on his phone beside Martin, glancing sideways every few seconds. On the screen, a video played without sound. Flashy edits, someone yelling, laughter from a friend beside him. Martin did not acknowledge it, but every flicker of bright motion in his periphery cast a ghostly reflection across his eyes. The boy looked at the cloth bundle in the old man's hand. He squinted at the edge of the medal just barely visible beneath the fabric, then turned to his friend. "That's like from war, right?" His friend shrugged. "Looks fake." Martin closed the folder. He didn't sigh. He didn't wince. He placed it gently on the chair beside him, laid the handkerchief-wrapped medal on top, and unbuttoned his coat with slow, deliberate fingers. One by one, 4 buttons came free. He slipped the coat open, exposing the inner lining, threadbare, but clean. The initials there had been stitched in ballpoint pen, long faded but still visible. KJS, 1970. Along the hem, another inscription, 117th AHC, Sidewinders. It meant nothing to anyone watching, but Martin saw it every day and remembered. Reynolds stepped forward again. The shift was casual but calculated. His heels scraped the tile slightly. His eyes landed on the metal now visible in Martin's lap again. He didn't speak. Not yet. But his smirk pulled at one corner like he was daring it to fall again. His presence was pressing against the room like a rising heat. From the next row, a heavy-set man with an envelope full of insurance forms leaned back with a smirk. "You think that's gonna get you out faster, Grandpa?" His voice was sharp, not cruel, just bored and entertained. His words hung in the air like cigarette smoke. Another voice chimed in, younger, closer to the entrance. "Let the real citizens through. You had your time." Martin blinked once, a long, patient blink. His jaw didn't clench. His lips didn't move. Only his thumb shifted slightly, pressing the cloth tighter against the metal beneath. Reynolds didn't stop them. He didn't correct them. He took a step closer, and with the flat of his boot, gently kicked the edge of the handkerchief. It slid a few inches across the vinyl seat. He didn't look at Martin, just kept walking. Martin reached forward, his spine creaking as he bent and retrieved the cloth bundle without urgency. He brought it back to his lap, recentered it, and adjusted the folder again. Everything returned to its place. No one said a word. The whispers faded. The laughter behind cupped hands died out. But something had shifted. Not in Martin. He remained still as stone. Not in Reynolds. His swagger hadn't cracked. But near the edge of the room, a woman in a navy skirt suit lowered her phone slowly from her ear. She had been watching since the first word had been spoken. And now, she turned toward the security desk, her lips parting, her voice soft but firm. And far beyond the building's walls, someone else had already answered. The clerk at the counter glanced down at her screen, then up at Martin, and then back again, fingers hovering over the keyboard as if she might type him a shortcut through the bureaucracy. Her mouth formed the shape of a question without voice. She pushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear and made the motion that her supervisor had taught her for compassion without compromise. A careful, procedural smile. Her smile meant help was considered. It did not mean permission. Reynolds noticed the movement like a predator notices a twitch in the grass. He stepped forward, long shadow crossing the linoleum, and planted himself between Martin and the counter as if the space were his to guard. His chest was broad beneath the uniform, the badge catching a glare from the light above. He spoke not to the clerk, but to the room, as if issuing a public notice. "Rules are rules," he said. The words landed like a divider. The air split, people aligning without choosing. A woman in a red coat reached out a tentative hand, as if to press the clerk on Martin's behalf. She had an envelope of forms tucked under her arm, and a face lined with worry. "He shouldn't have to wait," she murmured, eyes on the man. The clerk opened her mouth to reply and then closed it when the officer's gaze snapped toward them. The red coat woman drew her hand back slowly, folding herself into the motion of resignation. The officer moved with an economy of motion that suggested both impatience and ownership. He leaned over and snatched the medal from Martin's lap with one quick motion, the handkerchief slipping free and fluttering to the floor. The medal dangled from its ribbon at the end of his fingers, an emblem turned trivial by contempt. He weighed it like a judge weighing a sentence, and then, with casual cruelty, tossed it toward the waste bin as if discarding both metal and message. The metal hit the trash can's rim and skittered inside. The sound of its striking refuse was softer than on the tile, but the image lodged in the chest of the room, a small glint of bronze swallowed by a gray maw. Conversation paused, not out of shock, but because no one knew how to respond to the quotidian violence of indifference. Only a child's breathy intake cut through the hush, an instinctive gasp for fairness. Martin's hand moved before reason could catch up. He stood with slow deliberation, knees protesting, fingers wrapped around the folder like a lifeline. He walked toward the can with measured steps, each one a small tally of years counted in bone and joint. The room watched him move, some with pity, some with boredom, many with the sharp inner calculation of how their own mornings might be altered by a single delay. He reached the bin and bent, not hurried, not theatrical, the way someone who has done the same small ritual for decades might bend. His fingers brushed the rim and then plunged into the depth of the can. The bronze came against a shadow of discarded paper and cold coffee cups. He felt it with 2 fingers and lifted it out, as if retrieving a relic from a tomb. He wrapped it in the trembling handkerchief and turned. Reynolds stepped forward like a barrier. "That's enough," he said, voice low but absolute, as if his authority were law rather than posture. He put a palm on Martin's shoulder, in a touch that sought to steady, but instead read as ownership. The gesture made other hands clamp tighter on forms, made a man in a suit cross his arms, made a clerk avert her eyes. A man who had been muttering in the 3rd row stood up, thick with indignation and ready to speak. He was not old, no veteran himself, but his face had that sudden flare of personal principle that flares bright and then cools. "Hey, you can't treat him like that," he began, voice rising. Reynolds's head turned like an animal's. The glare that hit the man was not merely annoyance. It was a promise of consequence. "Sit down," Reynolds snapped, the single word a closing of a gate. The man folded back into his seat, the heat of his courage leaking out like air from a tire. Around him, the room exhaled in synchrony, the release of collective fear. From the corner where the security desk sat, an older guard pushed his ear toward the exchange like someone tuning a radio, and in that small motion his fingers found the phone that sat funkily mounted to the wood. He thumbed the receiver, not to call for escalation, but perhaps to record the moment in the ledger of things he would say nothing about later. His hesitance was a tiny bell ringing against the soft fabric of duty. The clerk at window 3 rose from her chair with a motion that suggested she had rehearsed 1,000 apologies. She cleared her throat and stepped around the counter, papers in hand, to offer a gentle directive. "Sir, we can prioritize veterans if you have qualifying documentation." Her tone was official. Her eyes were avid with the private question of whether the system might bend for one man. Reynolds's hand hovered over his radio. He moved with institutional certainty, the kind that says uniform comes first. "We enforce fair order here," he said without emphasis, words ready as a shield. "No special treatment just because some man says he served." The room shifted, not in unison, but in the microcurrents of self-preservation. Martin did not reply. He turned his chin up a fraction, not in defiance but to steady himself. "I did my part," he said, voice small but steady, the sound of sand shaken from a jar. He held out the medal wrapped again as proof rather than plea, an old soldier returning evidence to a court that could not read his handwriting. There was a silence then that was not emptiness, but a kind of pressure, like compressed air waiting to be released. A woman near the door covered her mouth with both hands, then lowered them, as if afraid to make the room wobble into something uncontrollable. The child who had been still now clutched at his mother's sleeve, eyes wide, a moral question forming inside his small chest. Another bystander, a man in a pressed business shirt, his hair still close-cropped, stood slowly. He opened his mouth, this time not when anger rose but when calculation cooled, and said simply, "This is wrong." The sentence hung, a fragile bridge across which others might step. Reynolds stepped forward, closing the gap with a gait designed to assert his will, and brushed past the businessman. His elbow clipped the man's ribs with the softness of a deliberate nudge. "You want to make this harder on yourself? Sit down," he said. His words were softer now, but the threat was sharper. The businessman slid back. The bridge collapsed under the weight of implied consequence. Martin, standing now with the medal tucked against his chest, did something small and private. He smoothed the cloth with the side of his palm, setting the fold as he had 100 times before. The action was not for show. It was the maintenance of a habit that had kept him tethered through worse storms than this waiting room. It steadied him, and in that steadiness, the room found a mirror it had been avoiding. The security guard finally set the receiver down and rose, badge glinting. He walked with official steps toward the cluster of voices, and the room held its breath as if expecting a ruling. His mouth opened, closed, emptied of words. He looked at Reynolds, then at Martin, then at the clerk, and finally at the little bronze medal resting in Martin's palm. He made a small motion with his hand, almost a shrug, and walked back to his post, as if the world had not shifted at all. As Martin turned to retrace his steps to the folding chairs, the medal slipped once inside the handkerchief and caught the light, flickering like a small sun against the dull, bureaucratic air. No one applauded. No one spoke. But a movement began at the far edge of the room, subtle as the lift of a curtain. A woman reached for her phone, Juno light blue case catching the fluorescent glow, and her thumb hovered above the contact named only for emergencies. The call was almost made. Martin stood still beside the garbage can, the handkerchief-wrapped medal cradled gently in both hands like a sacred object reclaimed from ruin. The room was no longer watching out of curiosity, but from a strange, quiet tension, the kind that settles when something ancient has been disturbed, and no one knows whether to bow their head or look away. He didn't move quickly. He didn't return to his seat with haste. He turned slowly, body stiff from time and surgeries, and walked with the deliberate grace of a man who had once learned to carry wounded friends across jungle terrain without letting them slip from his arms. The seat he returned to had cooled in the short minutes he'd been gone. As he lowered himself back down, his knees creaked softly, a sound swallowed by the humming light fixtures above, and his breath escaped in a long, steady exhale. The folder sat untouched beside him, the papers still aligned, the order undisturbed. He placed the medal down atop it once more, not hidden, not displayed, simply where it belonged. Reynolds stood near the far wall now, arms crossed again, but his jaw had tightened and his eyes darted more often to the people in the room. He seemed to be waiting for someone, anyone, to echo his authority, to agree, to nod and remind him he had done the right thing. But the room offered no affirmation. The silence wasn't obedience anymore. It was waiting. Martin took out a cloth from his inside coat pocket, not the one the medal had been wrapped in, but a second one, pale blue and monogrammed with letters that had begun to fray at the edges. He unfolded it slowly, laid it across his thigh, and then picked up the medal again. With practiced care, he wiped the surface, turning the metal with gentle fingers, rubbing in slow circles like a man remembering a story without words. A single scuff mark from the garbage can's edge resisted the cloth. Martin tried again, then again, and when it would not vanish, he paused, cloth still poised mid-polish, and simply let his hand fall. The imperfection remained. He did not hide it. He did not frown. He set the medal down and folded the cloth once, twice, tucked it back into his coat, and laid his hands in his lap. Across the room, the child who had gasped earlier now sat up straighter. He had not spoken again, but his eyes tracked Martin's movements the way children follow page turns in stories their fathers once read aloud. His mother said nothing, only placed a hand over the boy's, her fingers trembling slightly, though she did not know why. Martin's breath was shallow but even, his shoulders squared. His eyes, once fixed on the scuffed tile beneath his feet, now lifted to the window near the entrance. Beyond the glass, a leaf skated down from a tree branch, twisting once before touching the ground. The breeze that had carried it was not felt inside, but Martin seemed to know it had passed. He did not look at Reynolds. He did not look at the other bystanders. He simply existed, fully, in the moment, anchored by ritual and patience. His silence wasn't surrender. It was the same silence a soldier holds while waiting for the last man to clear the landing zone. The kind that says, "We leave no one behind, even if the world walks away." The mark on the floor where the medal had struck was faint now, just a smudge, an echo of the earlier insult. But Martin's eyes found it, held it in their line of sight. He stared not with bitterness but with acknowledgement. That place on the tile would outlive the day. It would be cleaned, polished, forgotten. But for him, it was part of the record, not of shame, but of endurance. A clerk at the far counter reached for her water bottle and knocked it over accidentally. It tumbled, hit the floor with a soft thud, and rolled toward Martin's feet. Without hesitation, Martin reached down and picked it up. He handed it back with a small nod, eyes never quite meeting hers, and she mumbled, "Thank you," before returning to her screen. Cheeks flushed, posture shifted. The waiting number flashed on the wall monitor. B43. The next file, in the endless rotation. Martin's number, C12, was still far off, but no one called the next name. The room seemed unwilling to move on, as if processing had been suspended by something older than policy. At the edge of the lobby, near the mounted state seal and dusty flag, the security desk buzzed softly. A light blinked once, then twice. The guard leaned forward, pressed a button, and held the receiver to his ear. The conversation was one-sided, the words indistinct, but the nod he gave afterward was slow and deliberate. When he stood, the air shifted. He did not speak to Reynolds. He did not approach Martin. He walked to the double doors, unlocked a side latch, and held one door open. A gesture too quiet to be noticed by most. But someone entered. Dark suit, narrow tie, steady gait. The kind of presence that doesn't ask for attention but earns it just by standing. He passed through the threshold without hesitation. His lapel bore a pin, small, silver, unmistakable. The Department of Defense emblem caught a glint from the overhead light as he moved into the lobby. Martin had not turned his head. His eyes were still on the smudge in the tile. But something in his spine, the angle of his shoulders, it shifted. Not as if he sensed danger, but as if something long overdue had finally arrived. The suited man crossed the lobby floor without pause. His steps did not echo, but the rhythm of his stride cut through the room more cleanly than any barked command or slammed gavel ever could. The tile underfoot seemed to respond to his movement, not with sound, but with reverence. People instinctively pulled their bags closer. Cell phones were lowered. Even the hum of the vending machine near the rear wall seemed to hush itself, as if the building understood something solemn was unfolding. He wore the kind of suit that fit too well to be off the rack, the fabric tailored with military precision. Yet his bearing was not vanity. It was discipline. His shoulders moved with that quiet calculation of a man who had once carried more than fabric, likely once armor or the weight of orders given too late. His hair was closely cropped, silvering at the edges, and his eyes scanned the room not with suspicion, but with memory. He wasn't looking for a threat. He was confirming one had already happened. At his side hung no weapon, no visible authority beyond a single clipped badge, a Department of Defense security credential that bore no flourish, only weight. The seal glinted briefly as he passed through a shaft of fluorescent light, and the security guard who had unlocked the door straightened unconsciously, his posture rising not out of fear but out of instinctive respect. Reynolds stiffened. The cop didn't speak, didn't move, but the set of his jaw changed. His arms, previously crossed in ease, now dropped an inch. His fingers twitched, the smallest betrayal of nerves that come not from guilt, but from recognition that the room was no longer his to control. The man in the suit didn't approach Reynolds. He didn't glance at him. He walked a slow arc around the periphery of the lobby, gaze sweeping across the waiting line, past the monitors, through the idle bodies of civilians now frozen in the theater of silence. His eyes paused briefly on the wastebasket, the mouth of it still agape, filled now with paper forms and the hollow scent of cheap sanitizer. Then they moved on. He came to a stop exactly 4 paces from where Martin Hale sat. He did not sit beside him. He didn't lean. He simply stood, his hands clasped lightly behind his back, as if reviewing troops on parade, not in judgment, but in ritual. Martin did not look up, but his posture shifted again, slightly straighter. He hadn't noticed the suit, but somehow he felt the gravity. The suited man turned, slowly, and walked to the front counter. The clerk at window 2 blinked up at him as though she'd forgotten her own name. He leaned in slightly, close enough to be discreet, and spoke 3 words. She nodded, lips parted, then tapped something on her screen with a deliberate slowness, as if unsure she was allowed to follow what she'd just been told. Behind the counter, a printer stirred, the mechanical hum suddenly loud in the stillness. A single page slid out, warm with ink, and she placed it carefully on the desk without reading it. The man gave a polite nod. Then he turned away, stepping back into the flow of the lobby like a diver re-entering water he had once called home. No announcement followed. No badge was flashed. But people began to adjust. Postures realigned. Someone near the vending machine stood. The mother beside the child placed her phone face down. Even the man in the business shirt who had tried to speak earlier found his breath again. Not enough to talk, but enough to sit taller, straighter. Martin finally looked up. His eyes, aged and lined with 1,000 miles of memories, landed on the man now standing beside him. He studied the lapel pin first, not the colors, but the engraving. Then he moved to the face. A long pause held between them, not discomfort, but something much older, something heavy and unfinished. The man in the suit said nothing. He reached slowly into his inner coat pocket and retrieved the medal. Not the one from the trash, not the damaged one still wrapped in cloth, but its twin. Identical. Pristine. It glinted in his palm, cradled not as proof, but as offering. Without a word, he bent one knee. The room shifted again. Gasps didn't follow. There was no murmur. Only the sound of a chair creaking as someone stood quietly in the back row, then another. The weight of bodies rising one by one without instruction, without leadership. Only truth. He extended the medal to Martin, not as a handout, but as restoration. Martin reached out, slowly, and took it. His fingers closed over the ribbon, not possessively, but carefully, as if afraid it might vanish. The man in the suit remained kneeling, his hand retreating only after the object had fully passed between them. And then, with perfect posture, he saluted. A full, formal salute. No words, no titles, no crowd acknowledgement. Just one man honoring another. Martin's hand rose in response. Unsteady, yes, but true. The line of his arm still remembered its angles. His shoulder held as long as it could. His fingers trembled at the peak, but he held it long enough. And when their arms lowered, the silence did not break. It deepened. The air inside the lobby had changed, not cleared, not healed, but recalibrated. The balance of presence had returned, and near the side wall, the officer named Reynolds took one small, unconscious step back. The man in the suit did not rise immediately. His salute ended slowly. Fingers held a second longer at his brow, then lowered with the gravity of someone placing a flag over a casket. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. Only when Martin lowered his own trembling hand did the man shift, one knee lifting, the other following, until he stood once again at his full height. The medal now rested in Martin's palm, its ribbon curling slightly in his grip, like something long separated finding its shape again. No one spoke. The clerk at the counter had forgotten her task, her eyes fixed on the center of the lobby, as if she too was waiting for permission to exhale. The man in the blue shirt, the one who'd smirked earlier, now sat motionless, his arms no longer crossed but resting on his knees, head tilted as if trying to reconcile what he thought he knew with what he had just witnessed. The suited man inhaled slowly, and then turned just slightly, enough to face Martin, but not so far as to command the room. His voice, when it came, was low and firm, not meant for performance, but for delivery. "Sir, permission to speak freely." Martin's gaze, which had not left the medal, lifted, steady, weathered, but alert. He gave a faint nod. It was not casual. It was protocol. The man continued, but not with title or rank. He didn't list credentials. He didn't offer a name. He began with something far more precise. "I was in my crib when your gunship came through on the river. Mekong Delta, October 1968. The words dropped like stones into still water, rippling out, pulling invisible threads between them. Martin did not react at first. He simply held the man in his gaze, letting the syllables land where they needed. The man's tone softened, the breath behind his words carrying something closer to grief than admiration. My father was there, Lieutenant Samuel Granger. He didn't make it home, but the last voice they heard on the radio, the one calling for airlift, giving grid marks, shouting coordinates, that was you. Martin blinked, once, slowly, but his face did not change. I remember the tapes, the man continued. My mother used to play them, just static and clicks. But she'd say, that voice, it gave her something to hold on to. She'd play it on rainy days. A long silence settled. Then Martin's mouth opened, not quickly, not smoothly, but like something that had rusted over finally shifting again. He was the one with the photograph, Martin said, his voice a dry rasp, barely audible. He kept it in his left chest pocket, wouldn't let anyone touch it. Said it was his boy. The man nodded. A baby in blue pajamas. That was me. Martin looked down at the metal again. His thumb brushed the edge, a familiar motion, like tracing a scar. He asked about you, even after the first shot, before we carried him. He said, make sure he knows I wasn't scared. The man's jaw tightened, but he did not cry. His eyes gleamed with the sheen of held-back emotion, but no tear fell. The room was silent, reverent, a church without walls. Somewhere in the back, someone sniffed softly. No one turned to see who. Martin's voice returned, barely more than breath. He was brave, all the way down. I never forgot. The man stepped back, just slightly, a gesture not of retreat but of space, allowing Martin to breathe. He turned to face the waiting room now, not to address them, but simply to acknowledge they were part of this moment whether they wished to be or not. But he said nothing further. Instead, he folded his hands in front of him, silent, present. Martin sat straighter in his chair, not proud, not defiant, just seen. The child near the back leaned forward, whispering something to his mother, but her hand gently hushed him, not in correction, but in reverence. No words were needed. The room had forgotten its purpose. It was no longer a place of lines and forms, bureaucracy and impatience. It had become something else entirely, a sacred ground for just a moment, suspended in time by two men who carried history in their bones and let the rest of the world glimpse it. Martin sat with the medal cradled in his palm, as if holding the weight of something that once burned and never stopped smoldering. His breath slowed, steady but shallow, like a man preparing to speak for the first time in years, not because he hadn't been asked, but because no one had truly been ready to listen. The suited man beside him said nothing more. His presence had opened the gate. Martin would decide what passed through it. His fingers, still stiff from age and cold, traced the back of the metal until they found the engraving worn nearly smooth by time. He didn't look up when he began to speak. His voice carried no ceremony. It was the tone of someone reporting facts that no one had ever believed. Not because they weren't true, but because they were inconvenient. That op was never in the books, Martin said, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. We weren't supposed to be there, no flag, no patch. They called us ghosts. Command didn't even use names, just call signs. Our bird was Echo 6-4. A murmur stirred at the far side of the room, but it faded quickly. No one dared interrupt. There were 6 of us, Martin continued. 3 gunners, 2 medics, 1 pilot. We'd been flying hot zones for weeks, napalm still in the air. We'd sleep in the hull if we could. One mission bled into the next, and then we got the call. He finally looked up, not to anyone in particular, but just to orient himself in the room again. His eyes were dry, but they had the look of someone walking backward through time without meaning to. Lieutenant Granger's convoy got ambushed, Mekong Bend. Mud so thick the wheels locked. They were sitting ducks. Command said to pull back, wait for daylight. But we were less than a mile out. We didn't wait. The suited man remained still, listening with the kind of attention that makes others uncomfortable. Not because it's intense, but because it is complete. We went in low, under the brush, took fire from both banks. Tail rotor got hit, but we stayed steady. Granger's squad was pinned. Most were down. Some had already stopped moving. Martin's hands tightened slightly, the ribbon in his fingers folding tighter. I covered the medics. Went out 3 times. First 2. Brought back bodies. Third time I found him. Your father. He was still talking, still giving orders. Bleeding out, but calling coordinates like the mission hadn't changed. The silence in the lobby had taken on a new texture. It was not just quiet now, it was reverent, almost sacred. He was cradling the photo, Martin said, finally meeting the man's eyes. A baby, blue pajamas. He kept it pressed to his chest even when I tried to lift him. I had to carry him out with one arm because he wouldn't let go. The man's breath caught, but he didn't speak. They never gave me a medal for that. The one I brought today wasn't even from that mission. That one got classified. The file sealed. Said it never happened. Said no such flight existed. Martin gave a small, humorless chuckle. The sound of a man not amused, but unsurprised. They said we couldn't report it. Said it would compromise diplomatic presence in the region. There was a civilian tied to the convoy. Foreign aid attaché's son. Died on impact. Whole thing had to be erased. He looked down at the medal again. So I kept flying. Never told a soul. Just kept this one. He lifted the medal slightly. Because it was the only thing they couldn't take away. The air shifted. From the security desk, a guard stepped forward cautiously. His voice was quiet, unsure. "Sir, should we remove the officer?" The suited man didn't turn. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Instead, he turned slowly to face the crowd. Not with accusation, but with clarity. His eyes scanned the room, pausing on each face as if weighing the weight they each carried, or failed to. Then he spoke. "Anyone here believe this man should wait in line today? Raise your hand." Not one hand moved. Even the officer, Reynolds, stood motionless, his gaze fixed somewhere to the left of Martin's chair. His posture had changed. Gone was the square chest, the tight jaw. In its place was something else, not remorse, not yet, but the edge of it, the realization of magnitude, the quiet cracking of confidence. Martin didn't gloat, he didn't smile. He simply sat, back straight, eyes calm, not as someone vindicated, but as someone returned to the ground after a long time floating outside the world. The room remained still, the moment hovering like smoke that refuses to lift. And though no one spoke it, something had been restored. The clerk behind the counter had not moved in nearly 2 minutes. Her hand hovered above a keyboard, mid-keystroke, as if her very breath had become a disruption to the silence. She wasn't the only one frozen. The entire room, once filled with idle murmurs and the dull rhythm of bureaucracy, now sat in a stillness that felt almost historical. It was as though every person present had the sense that this moment, this veteran, would be remembered longer than anything else that happened in that building that week, or maybe even that year. The man in the suit finally stepped forward, slowly but deliberately. The small Department of Defense pin on his lapel caught the light just long enough for the room to recall its meaning. He reached the clerk's counter and gently rested his fingertips on the worn Formica surface. His voice did not rise above conversational tone, but it carried through the space like an executive order whispered through generations. "Ma'am," he said, "is there a policy here for veterans with visible commendations?" The clerk swallowed hard, blinking herself back into motion. I don't think there is. We just process in order of arrival." The man nodded. "Understood. Is there a printer available?" "Yes, sir," she replied instantly, as if the answer had been rehearsed. He reached into his jacket, withdrew a leather folio, and pulled from it a single page of stationery bearing the Department of Defense header. He unfolded it slowly, the weight of the paper thick enough to suggest permanence. Then he pulled out a pen, black, fine point, metal-bodied, and signed the paper with 3 slow strokes. "This building," he said, still without raising his voice, now observes immediate processing for any verified veteran in possession of commendation, discharge documents, or visual identifiers of service. He slid the paper across the counter. I recommend it be posted at both entrances and kept in policy records. Consider it a procedural clarification. The clerk nodded, then took the paper like one might handle something holy. She turned to her printer, and the low mechanical hum became the only sound in the room. The suited man turned to the security officer who had stood quietly throughout the exchange. Not the one who had disrespected Martin, but the older man, the one whose eyes had glistened earlier. "Post it," he said simply. The officer accepted the fresh copy without a word and moved to the bulletin board near the door. His steps were unhurried, each one as deliberate as a changing of the guard. The man turned again, this time walking not toward Martin, but toward the people waiting, the seated, the fidgeting, the formally impatient. He made no announcement. He simply stood, centered between the numbered booths, hands clasped loosely in front of him. "I was born because of a man like this," he said, the words falling like solemn bells. "I was educated, protected, and raised free because of men like this. And yet today, we all sat." He let the silence hang. There was no shaming in his tone, only observation, and the weight that comes with realizing you missed a chance to do right, not by malice, but by inertia. "The department is reviewing all points of service protocol across federal and state entities," he added. "But we start here, today, with this man, this place." He turned back to Martin, whose posture had not changed, who had still not spoken since the last story had left his mouth. "You're clear to proceed," the man said. "Or, if you'd prefer, we can handle your paperwork off-site, in private." Martin looked up, then slowly shook his head. "No, I'll wait. Others were here first." The suited man's brow lifted slightly, but he offered a small nod, the kind that recognized integrity not as an ideal, but as lived muscle memory. The people in line shifted, but not one moved forward. The clerk looked up, hesitated, then called, "Mr. Hale, window 3 is ready for you." As Martin stood, slow but unassisted, the crowd parted. No orders given, no lines drawn. It was reflex. He walked forward with his folder tucked neatly under one arm, the medal now zipped carefully inside the side pocket. Not displayed, not flaunted, but safe. Returned to the only hands that had ever earned it. As he reached the counter, the young clerk there stood up straight, met his eyes, and whispered only 4 words. "Thank you for staying." Martin gave a small nod, said nothing, but the corner of his mouth, just barely, lifted. Behind him, the new policy notice was being pinned to the door with brass tacks, its heading bold against the gray bulletin board. "Veterans served with honor and served first." And in that moment, the waiting room was no longer just a waiting room. It had become a place of reckoning and remembering. 1 week later, the morning sun hung low and sharp in the October sky, stretching long shadows across the pavement outside the Department of Motor Vehicles building. The glass double doors reflected a clear blue, a rare kind of blue, the kind only certain autumns know how to give. Above them, freshly mounted in the steel frame, the sign glinted quietly. The lettering was clean, new, but already weathering just slightly from the mountain wind. Veterans served with honor and served first. Martin Hale walked with the same pace he always had, deliberate even, steady in defiance of the ache that rode in both knees. His coat, dark brown wool with soft-lined elbows, was buttoned against the chill. In one hand, he carried the same leather folder. In the other, nothing. He needed it free, just in case he had to help someone else open a door. Inside, the rhythm of the building had changed. It wasn't louder. It wasn't busier. But there was a different kind of stillness now. Not the dull silence of indifference, but the quiet of awareness, of attention, of people watching with more than just their eyes. As Martin stepped past the security desk, the older guard straightened his back and gave him a simple nod. No salute, no spectacle. Just the kind of nod one soldier gives another, even across decades. In the seating area, the same row of plastic chairs lined the wall. Today, however, one was occupied by a young man in a zip-up sweatshirt, its shoulder bearing a small, freshly sewn patch. It wasn't military. It was navy blue, stitched in white thread. Vet ally. He stood when Martin approached, not out of habit, but out of something quieter. Respect that had not yet found a name in his generation's vocabulary. He offered his seat, but Martin waved it off gently and sat beside him instead. The young man looked nervous, not in fear, in hope, in wanting to do something right and not knowing how. He cleared his throat. "I read about last week," he said quietly. "Didn't know what to say, then, but I wanted to learn." Martin turned, met his eyes for just a moment, then opened his leather folder. No lecture, no speech. He simply pulled out a few documents and laid them across both their laps. Discharge forms, housing paperwork, and the neatly folded pamphlet the clerk had given him that day. "This one," Martin said, tapping the housing form with a worn fingertip. "Goes here, underlined section. Initial it before you sign, or they'll send it back." The young man nodded, eyes locked on the pages like scripture. 2 rows away, the same clerk from a week prior looked up and saw them sitting there, the old veteran and the young man with the fresh patch. She didn't interrupt. She just smiled slightly, then turned back to her screen. When Martin's number was called, he didn't need to move, because the clerk at window 2 had already stood. "Mr. Hale," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "you're welcome to come forward, or we're happy to come to you." Martin closed the folder, stood slowly, and walked the familiar path to the counter. The metal wasn't visible this time. It didn't need to be. It lived in the quiet now, in the behavior, in the new ritual that had taken root without ceremony. As he handed over his updated documents, he turned once more to glance back at the chairs. The young man was helping someone else, an older woman this time, understand how to fill out a benefits claim. He wasn't correcting, he was guiding, like he'd been taught. Outside, the wind stirred the new sign again. The brass screws holding it in place gleamed like medals of their own. Not worn on chests, but on the very frame of the building. Permanent, unapologetic. Martin didn't stay long. When the paperwork was filed and the signature scanned, he tucked his folder under his arm and tipped his chin to the clerk. "Appreciate your time," he said. She nodded. "We appreciate your years." He stepped out into the morning light. It was brighter now. Not from the sky, but from something inside the building behind him. Something that would not fade. The door closed quietly behind him, and the ritual continued. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you are watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.